Happy Rotation Day, everybody! The start of the month brings with it a new patch, and we have a good deal of changes to go over between updates to cards previously existing within the Revolution Custom Standard roster, as well as tweaks to incoming cards from both Innistrad Witching Hour and Valir the Banished Isle. We have quite a lot of cards to talk about here, not just the 2026 World Championship card, but 16 in rotation changes, a sweeping change to a tricky to combat permanent type, a couple adjustments to Eternal, and over 100 balance changes, both big and small, some buffs, some nerfs, between our two new sets joining the format today. Let's hop in. As always, there are links in the description below for your key resources to check out all things Revolution Custom Standard, such as the Custom Magic Discord server where you can get updates about and play the format against others, as well as check out all of the cool cards and sets that people in the community are designing. The Revolution Compendium, where you can look through all of the cards the curators recommend for consideration in your decks, sorted by card roles. The official LackeyBot format search, a search engine integrated into the same website as the compendium, and tournament data, complete with patch history and data on what decks a card is seeing play in. Escape from Limbo, a Scryfall-like website using the GitHub framework set up by Canterbury Egg, and showcasing the cards in the format with complete visual spoilers, a random card button, sets catalog, and a built-in deck builder. And finally, a new addition to the list of resources to turn to, a deck building website designed by our latest world champion, Tremor. It's got a ton of tools to make building your decks easier and giving you access to a handy visual tool to make brewing and planning for league runs, GPs, and more all the easier. Check out all of these spaces with links in the description below. We've got one new card to discuss before we get into patch notes. Designed by our aforementioned 2026 Revolution World Champion is Worn Semblance. It's 2 and a blue for a 2/4 illusion horror that surveils 2 on enter, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, it triggers to let you have it become a copy of another creature you control until end of turn, though it retains the copy ability and the horror type in the process. Honestly, I'm not quite sure how best to use this. It's got 2 types that are relevant to Twiltree stuff in particular, and though Illusion's payoffs are a bit tight, there are some solid horror payoffs looking for a density of more playable options. And Semblance being capable of both copying those payoffs and retaining the relevant horror typing is a pretty big benefit. You can also just copy up general value creatures, though with so many of our better value creatures right now being on-enter triggers or even on-cast triggers, it's not quite clear what cards this wants to team up with. Ultimately, I think Worn Semblance is a pretty strong card overall, most likely fit for mid-range shells with some potential combo use. With the body and initial surveil being as good as it is, there's definitely some reason to try this out if you're looking for a clone effect. All right, let's start with talking about the in-rotation changes. And before we can go into individual cards, we should talk about the rework to battles. The ones that we received in Exalts of Twiltree are now becoming enchantments in addition to battles. This makes them more generally vulnerable to opposing removal, because now any options that remove enchantments can pick these off in turn, which drastically improves the suite of options we have to combat these pesky permanents. It also opens up some new avenues of synergy, though, because these weren't designed with enchantment synergies in mind, and there are already proven Enchantment Matters tools like Karaz's Monument that could be gaining new potential toys from this change. It's a great way to help shore up this weak point for the format's interactive suite, but I'm also curious to see what new interactions become possible now that you can use things meant for enchantments on things that weren't designed to interact with them. We'll kick off the individual changes this month by talking about last month's big breakout decks. The big talk of the World's Field was Zukar Temple Lock, a combo using Zukar Null champions to donate Temple of Origins to an opponent while having it set to colors that aren't relevant to them, thus preventing them from being able to generate mana of their usual colors. This interaction definitely wasn't an intended or desired one, and though there was talk once the tournament kicked off of it even being changed before any matches were played in Worlds, it ultimately just ended up staying as is for the month and being banned out of Archaeologist in the meantime, so it didn't distract from the GP. Sure enough, Tremor was able to pilot a black-green mid-range deck running the combo all the way to a nearly perfect Worlds run, dropping only a single game in the Grand Finals match after an undefeated upper bracket run. That final match also proved that the deck wasn't really dependent on the combo in order to perform. So despite the combo being as powerful as it was, there's definitely other things that Black-Green midrange has going for it beyond just Zukar and Temple of Origins. Zukar's overall baseline strength is going unchanged this month because his core effects weren't causing any problems, but he can no longer donate lands with his +1. This not only shuts off Temple Lock as an avenue of play, but also insulates us from any further lands we may want to donate from becoming a problem. That's not all, though. Temple of Origins is also getting future-proofed against additional donate effects we might gain down the line. Its enter effect that chooses 2 colors now adds the color restriction to that choice rather than separately for as long as you control the land, meaning that if you were to be able to donate the temple, it just makes it a normal dual land from there onwards. There could be something cute to do with donating and then regaining control of the temple to break the restriction, but we don't really have any means to do that, and I don't know if it's really worth wasting your time on that anyways. Just run it as it was intended to be. It's a 2-color fast land that doesn't let you play 3-color mana bases. The other big breakout deck of the World's Field was Temur Wish combo, brought by World's runner-up Lilasor, using Last Wish in conjunction with Black Dawn Historian to tee up a double-cast Last Wish the following turn, netting you 10 mana and access to both halves of a 2-card combo from the sideboard, provided you can last one more turn. Well, even with one half of that combo rotating as of today, that setup is still a bit too strong, so Last Wish is catching a self-exile clause as part of its resolution. It's still a really strong toolbox card, you're just going to need to lean on more generally powerful things, or work a bit harder to make it a real combo tool. Though we do have a mana doubler coming in, so that untap effect could actually become really mana positive. A major component of Temur Wish was that it wasn't just leaning on Last Wish to play cards out of the sideboard. It was also using some of the dragon control pieces that we'd seen perform across the season, most importantly, Iviana Dragon Tamer. Iviana's use alongside particularly Asulio the Watchful Star has been really powerful over the entirety of the Solitaire season, with her -2 netting you the exact 2 treasures you need to cast Path of Humility. We've seen her also perform with other powerful dragons as well across Solistaire's season, Draconos Magistus being an uncounterable 3-mana counterspell represented immediately off of her -2 if you have just one other untapped land. Eltanon being a small immediate board wipe that you can play even if you aren't in white. And even Garatian Stormlord finally getting a moment in the sun after almost a year in the format by that point, as a way to leverage Iviana getting multiple dragons out of your sideboard and giving them haste. Ultimately, something had to give, and that give comes at Iviana's treasure tokens, which she now creates tapped. This still means you can threaten to have 7 or 8 mana the turn after you curve her out, which means you still could cast Garatian the turn after you put Iviana into play, but you can no longer run her out and use her to find and represent stack interaction. This is a small hit to Iviana, but I think it's a bigger hit to Asulio the Watchful Star, actually, whose strength was really reliant on that adventure cost being paid for by her down tick. We might still see more of Iviana yet, but this is a real damper to her overall strength. And also relevant to those strategies is the hit to Draconos Magistus, stripping the uncounterability from its adventure spell. I don't think this is spontaneously now an awful card. 3-mana counterspell that can't be duressed and which draws an uncounterable threat for later is still a solid offering. But this does make the Dragons package a bit more interactable on the stack. We still have Silent Lakefront if you're desperate for an uncounterable counterspell, but with the only option now sitting at 5 mana, it may be time to look to other ways to win stack wars. Our last Iviana-related hit comes for the Jeskai builds, as well as a whole host of other red-white shells. Offset Daemons receiving a hit to its toughness down to 3/2, as well as having its subroutine be changed to now sacrifice when it runs, only returning the Daemon to hand in the process rather than the battlefield. This does mean that you can then cast it and get another overflow token, but it means that you'll have to keep investing mana back into the Daemons to keep getting them back into play. The toughness change does also sting, making options like Magma Spray slightly more relevant overall in the field, as well as making 2-power flyers and reach creatures better at fighting the Daemon, but I don't think this has become unplayable, just a lot fairer. Envoy of the Fallen has been a boogeyman over the last season, even though it only really got play in the first and last GPs of the Solitaire season. Folks have been coming prepared for it across every single tournament in the first 4 months of this year. The combination of immediate lethality and immediate board refresh is getting a couple hits now, as it's both going up in mana from 4 to 5, and also shedding both lifelink and its free sacrifice to damage opponents ability in favor of a 2-mana sacrifice ability to draw 2 and discard 1, recouping the 1 point of toughness that it lost in a previous nerf across the full exchange. I think overall, Envoy is just not something you can reach for the traditional machine gun aristocrats shells that it was popping up in, but I don't think it's terrible. 5 mana for a 3/3 alongside 3 mana worth of creatures from the bin is a solid board state out of nowhere, and the sacrifice ability does have some value potential. But I do think the loss of the powerful lethal sack outlet is something that sacrifice-oriented decks will be feeling in the coming months. Aristocrats is actually catching another change because alongside Envoy's power, another really integral part of the core was that we had 2 different 1-drops that could convert into treasures upon death, with Newborn Oni and Omen Skulker. Well, something's going to change there because Omen Skulker's no longer dying into making treasures. It's now a 1/4 skeleton for 1 and double black that draws you a card and has you lose 1 life whenever you cast a white, blue, red, or green spell, and it generates a treasure whenever it attacks instead of dying. Obviously, this is another hit to the sacrifice plan overall, but I do think this is a solidly appealing value engine at 3 mana. I'm not sure where it will want to exist exactly, but we have seen 3 mana 1/4s that draw cards do work in black before, so this could very well make some waves. I know I have a plan for it in Eternal, so maybe I'll put it through its paces in June if nothing else. Next are a few changes to the green-white tokens shells, starting with Syra Blade of Memory. She's been completely reworked from a 2/3 that cares about your creatures entering to a simple 4 mana 4/5 that can't be countered, locking your opponents out from casting spells outside of their own turns while also having lifelink. This is obviously a far less explosive card, but I think this is still a solid way to punish more reactive strategies as well as protect your sorcery speed plays from being countered. Against blue decks, or anything leaning on toughness-based removal, or counter spells to try and deal with your threats, Syra can punch through relatively confidently, and against more aggressive shells, 5 toughness and lifelink are a really solid pair to help you stabilize. I feel like folks are going to write her off, and I don't blame anyone who does, but I think she's still a pretty real card. I may be a bit less optimistic about Honesty, but it is still solid. It's also getting a full rework, now creating a 1/1 soldier token whenever a non-token creature you control enters, and tapping a permanent while stripping its abilities for a turn whenever you attack. This is best when you can repeatedly put creatures in and out of play, so think things like reprieve creatures or getaway proxy for the most part, but it can also just be extra bodies on top of your token effects or extra fodder in an Abzan sack shell. The soldiers tokens could also be relevant if you try and tie the Twiltree soldiers together with some of the new goodies from Innistrad, though I'm hesitant to be as confident in this working for that particular shell. It's not awful, but a definite step down. We are getting a partial buff in compensation, though with one notable drawback stapled onto it. Halo Tracer is going back down to a 2 mana 2/2, and its draw is now predicated on you gaining life in the turn rather than having more life than an opponent. That's a big deal for helping you draw more consistently here, and the reduction in cost is greatly appreciated, but it now only triggers when it attacks rather than once per turn when you gain life. This makes it a lot worse curved out off of something like Sun Sower than it was at the start of Solisteir's season, and a lot more vulnerable to dying after getting just a tiny bit of value, but 2 mana is still a whole lot less than 3, so it might still be useful. Big change to Clash at Mistrit Vale here. It's moving that prowess ability up to the top, so it's online immediately, which is definitely a boost to its consistent damage output, but it's now only making 2 soldier tokens once it's taken a point of damage rather than every turn. And its cost reduction clause is completely gone in exchange for it tapping down up to 2 permanents and shutting off their abilities while they're tapped, and giving them a stun counter. 2 non-lane permanents, I should say, once it's defeated. It's less of an insulated win condition now, and the enchantment change makes it more fragile as well, but with the high density of good cantrips and cheap tempo threats we have, this might still be a real avenue of attack, even if you just point a shock at it to get the 1/1 tokens and then just ignore the last clause. A very minor change here, a Dance of Ruin and Whisper is picking up an up to 1 clause for its targeting on enter, meaning you're no longer forced to bounce something. It's a nice small buff to make it easier to use. I think it'll still be quite good. Now for some additional assorted changes. Kitsune Matriarch's picking up a 1 per turn clause on its trigger, keeping it from spiraling out of control as you make more tokens in a single turn. This is a definite hit to its overall potential, but it's still quite a snowbally card, so it might still do some real work if you can play it on turn 1. Mantico's Expurgus' adventure, Path of Purity, is now restricted to targeting artifacts and non-basic lands you don't control, meaning you can no longer pop your own artifacts to ramp yourself. This could still cause some problems with token removal, but as we'll get into in the Valir section, there's also a change coming to remove that avenue of interaction, so Manticos won't get to be a full Stone Rain anytime soon. Last for the in-rotation changes is a slight shift for Mercenary of Dusk. It's losing the warrior type to now be as its name entails, giving us a mercenary to look to for our synergies without having to lean solely on Valir cards. It's a slight buff to any playable Mercenary Matters cards like Desperate Ambusher or Volwood Deadeye, and Mercenary of Dusk was already a properly strong aggro threat, so this is a nice avenue of synergy to boost it up. We're going to bridge into Eternal talk with a fun little errata here. Secrets of Strixhaven has introduced a big official Magic errata to introduce the book subtype for a whole bunch of artifacts, and Revolution is getting in on the fun. Tome of the Primordials, Maple's Journal, Last Grimoire of Nirgabal, Dreadlich Codex, and Stella's Journal are now all books, in case that ever becomes relevant. For now, this won't matter too much, both because there's nothing that does care about it, and because the most recent of these to exist in the format just rotated out today. But hey, these exist in Eternal for the future in case we do ever pick up any synergies. For Eternal changes themselves, we're looking at changes mostly to the Eternal ban list. The 2 1-mana flickers are leaving the ban list and receiving changes to their effects, and we have a new card joining the ban list. For 2nd X Radiance, it's shedding the flicker mode entirely in exchange for a mode that lets you counter a spell targeting you. It's also getting a boost to its Graveyard Hate mode, letting you target 2 cards from just 1 and gaining you 2 life. And the last mode is no longer putting a +1/+1 counter on something, but instead giving it +1/+1 and first strike for the turn. So it's better in combat immediately, but less good at long-term stat generation. It remains a solid, efficient tool with a lot of flexibility, though with new competition in Cathar's Charm, it remains to be seen what will or won't line up to Eternal's threats and interaction as far as 1-mana modal instants go in white. Experimental Flight, meanwhile, is jumping up to 2 mana and losing the ability to target planeswalkers, getting a slight buff in compensation, letting the creature that you flicker enter with either a flying or +1/+1 counter rather than just always getting a flying counter. Despite the cost increase, this remains our cheapest way to flicker artifacts in Eternal, and we still have some strong effects like Harvesting Blade just begging to get flickered, so it may still have some role in the Eternal field. Last up, No Time to Waste has been banned from Revolution Eternal. This was being used primarily in conjunction with In Search of Peace to permanently steal one of your opponent's permanents, taking it for a couple turns with no time, and then using it any other spell to exile that permanent with Aesop, so that the enchantment could just return it to your board forever. That is still possible with Nosa Research Executive, which can actually be flickered by Aesop herself, but that's slightly more costly overall and demands a 3rd color, so while Aesop theft is still possible, and I will frown at you for doing so, it's less accessible overall. We're moving into changes for Innistrad Witching Hour, in the same order as we talked about cards during the set review. We'll start with lands, where there's been a change to the Desolate cycle. They're now all moving from fast lands that always surveil 1 to lands that you may have enter tapped or untapped. They only surveil 1 if you choose to get them tapped instead of always, and if you have them untapped, then you can have them untapped whenever, not just on the first couple turns. There are 2 additional changes across this cycle, first with Desolate Garrison's tokens now being created tapped. This means you can't use this to spit out ambush blockers, but it's still a really efficient ability overall on an otherwise reasonable utility land, so I think the mixture of always being untapped when you need it and making some bodies in a pinch will still leave this quite reliable. Desolate Pinnacle's a little less reliable because it can no longer damage creatures, but it's still going to be a really strong effect, because I cannot imagine a red burn or aggro deck looking at this change and caring about only being able to target opponents for 3 damage. I think all 5 Desolate lands still look quite good, with the Enter effect making them more consistent at making mana where you need them to, and these 2 ability nerfs are rather minor, so I think you can count on seeing all 5 of these moving forward still. On to white cards from Innistrad. Moldgraph Stewards is getting a change to its activated ability, now only allowing you to give itself indestructible, but no longer requiring it to be attacking and costing 1 less mana to do so. While this is a slight hit to your overall board resilience, this is a stellar buff for it as a standalone aggro tool, and I suspect this might be even better for white aggressive planes moving forward than it already was. Slight toughness hit to Dawn Smite Cavalier from 3-2 down to 3-1. It'll be a bit more frail to chump blockers trading with it, but it has graveyard recursion, so it probably won't care too much. Geist Marshal is shedding flying across both itself and the token it makes. It can no longer anthem your other spirits when you opt not to make one, and it now triggers on combat damage to an opponent rather than on attack. However, for all of these losses, there are some notable gains. First off, its stats are getting squared out to 2/2, meaning it applies more pressure on its own. Secondly, the fail case if you don't make a token is now a +1/+1 counter to another spirit you control, meaning you get to build more persistent stat boosts over time. Lastly, and I think most interesting for my purposes, that token trades off flying for the soldier type as well. That means that this works for just 2 kindred themes now rather than just spirits, and you already know I believe in my own hype for Radiant Devotee. Those tokens being blue could also be relevant for Devotee, making the blue splash more reliable over time, so that's another great boost. Curse of Eerie Streets got a full redesign to simplify it down. It now just costs a single white mana to curse a player, having their creatures enter tapped and gaining you 1 life whenever a creature they control enters. It's a solid little control tool to combat aggro now that it is a solid little control tool to combat aggro now, rather than a potential win condition for grindy matchups. It's clearer now to know where this wants to exist, so if you're struggling against go-wide strategies, give this a try. Eerie Night Drifter is catching a hit to its enter trigger, only getting you 1 card rather than 2. It's maybe still worth the trouble, especially now that battles are eligible hits, but it's definitely less potent overall. Ashiok's Manipulation is catching hit to its consistency at gaining Flash, now requiring your opponent to have cast 2 or more spells rather than just 1. This is still a solid little bounce effect, and while it's less potent overall, I think it'll still have its uses. Nebelgast Retainer's catching a rate hit to its activated ability, now costing 1 additional mana, but it also no longer taps 2 untapped flyers you control, and instead just requires you to have 2 flyers on your board when you activate. This means that the activation is easier to yield more value from because you'll have more flyers to swing in and draw with than you otherwise would have with the old version. I think that despite the cost going up, this is a net bonus, because while it's more costly to flip, it'll get far more done when you do so. Selhoff Conduit's gotten a full rework, trading off the pseudo prowess for a flying granting effect, and always drawing a card when it attacks now, though you'll have to put a card from your hand on the bottom of your deck if you don't have the 4 or more unique instants and sorceries clause met. The evasion is a nice trade-off in place of the scaling, especially because it makes that attack trigger safer to rely on. The draw always happening is also a nice boon, so while it's not going to kill as fast, I think this is still a strong value tool. Curse of Insidious Thoughts has been streamlined a bit, now specifically hating out tutor effects by way of forcing the enchanted player to reveal and shuffle away any non-land card they find when they search their library. Route Navigator hasn't done too much work as of yet, but we're getting more plentiful and powerful tutor effects over time, so having access to this kind of effect in more colors is definitely nice. Demented Pyro Alchemist is catching a pair of text changes, with its activated ability setting up a delayed trigger to give power 2 or less creatures you control haste for the turn when they enter, while its token generation clause is now a conditional check at the beginning of each combat rather than with every single instant and sorcery you cast. It is getting to gain a point of power as compensation for these hits, and I think if the old version of Clash at Mistrit Vale is any indication, this trigger could still spit out some consistent stats over time. Grasping Dreams is taking a 1 mana cost increase to cast, but now exiles the target and lets its owner cast it by paying 2 additional mana to do so. This probably won't move the needle on its playability too much, but it's definitely more interesting than a bounce spell in terms of how it functions for this kind of strategy, so maybe. I still think the flashback is really bad, though. Haven Ghoul Prodigy is dropping a point of toughness down to 0/3. Makes it slightly more vulnerable to toughness-based removal and slightly worse at blocking, but I think this is still one of the best Stitch cards there is. Hergast's activated ability is now being restricted to sorcery speed, though you can still activate it at instant speed the turn that they've entered. Slightly worse overall now, but if you're looking to do shenanigans with that activated ability, you can still slide finality counters or stun counters to your opponent's permanents, even at instant speed the turn that you play Hergast. One thing I neglected to mention is that you could theoretically slide stun counters over to your opponent's lands, so if you're feeling petty, I wouldn't recommend it, but you can do it. Rancid Practitioner is taking a toughness hit down to 3/2, making it more susceptible to small burn spells and removal, as well as more at-risk as well as being more at risk in combat. Given that death trigger, though, it may mean you have more opportunities to rebuy an instant or sorcery as well, because there are more situations where blocking leads to this rebuying something, or getting blocked leads to getting to rebuy something. So I'm not even sure this makes it worse by any measure. It just makes it more interesting to consider in combat. Ashiok has had their ultimate cleaned up a bit to make it clearer how it works, and their +1 has been toned back to no longer strip abilities from whatever it taps. I'm still wary of where this could be used, and this does hit its overall strength a bit, but if you're willing to give them a shot, I don't think they're too much worse now. Breathstealer's spirits dropped 2 points of toughness, making it harder for this to profitably trade while stealing something. Probably disqualifies it from being worth reaching for in Constructed, but it's still a hell of a draft card, so who knows, maybe it crops up in Curator's Cube. I can say words, I promise. Captain Falmore's activated ability has changed mana cost and card count, only requiring you to exile 2 cards from your graveyard rather than 3, but you do have to pay 3 mana instead of 2. This will be harder to weave into turns now for sure, but it's likely still a solid 1-drop for mid-rangey plans. Disciple of Darker Powers is also exiling 1 fewer card to do its thing now at the cost of 1 more mana. Now you have to pay 3 black and eat 4 cards to have it come back as a 5/4, making me less confident in it overall, but if you want cheap aggressive zombies or warlocks, this is probably still a fine option to reach for. Farbog Invocation's Stitch mode has been removed, allowing it to be replaced fully and become Bone Shards. I think the removal mode was the more appealing option to me anyhow for Reanimator Shells in specific, so I think we'll probably still see a lot of this card. It didn't really need the Stitch to be playable. Greedy Duelist's Gorge now happens when it hits a player rather than on attack, but also now no longer costs you life to do so. This makes it easier to use in conjunction with something like Ignited Soul, where you can now use the soul to pitch an excess land and dig for a non-land to loot away with the Duelist, or even just sacrifice the Ignited Soul to Gorge. But it does mean that Duelist is a slower clock overall. I think it's ultimately a price worth paying because it's less of a liability against other aggressive decks. And it still hits like a truck over time. Curse of Profane Offerings has had its activated ability cost reduced by 1, and now that ability deals 1 to the enchanted player. But that's because the death trigger has replaced the drain with Surveil 1, meaning that this is also no longer a real Aristocrat's tool. This kind of strands Smiling Sludge as the primary Blood Artist of choice, and it's a big hit to Witching Hour as the previous best curse to search up with it. I'm not sure Witching Hour will even see that much play as of this change, and I don't imagine we'll see much of Curse of Profane Offerings over the next few months either. Beckon the Beyond's had a slight hit to its options, no longer allowing you to grab non-black planeswalkers unless you're wishing for Ashiok in the process. This cuts out tutoring up Iviana or other more generally powerful planeswalkers and points us towards specific options in color for this spell. Shout out to anyone that was looking at specific black planeswalkers to wish for. This functionally is unchanged for you. Ceaseless Horseman's got a small hit here. It's trading out Menace for Death Touch to be more reliably blockable, and its Death Trigger now checks for 3 zombie cards in your graveyard if you don't have one other zombie in play. It's weaker, but if you still want this style of card, it's still likely going to be good at doing what you need it to do. Apologies for the random Evolving Wilds here. That is a template card that I guess I just forgot to delete. Deadly Invitation is renamed Fliction of Undeath because it's losing its Exile clause and instead becoming a modal spell that lets you choose between -2/-2 to all creatures or Stitch 4. This is where the Stitch went from Farbog Invocation, and I think this is a much cleaner option. I do think that folks will definitely miss the Exile component of Deadly Invitation, but I do think this is also still a very interesting card. As we've seen with Nightfall, having the option to just turn your board wipe into a 4/4 if you don't need the board wipe is pretty good. Sorin, Errant Bloodlord's uptick is going from +2 down to +1, but his ult's nudging from -8 to -6 to compensate. I think he's still generally pretty strong, and that cheaper ultimate might make him the ideal candidate for use alongside the Founder's Cage as a means to help him jump up to that big burst of damage more swiftly. Horrific Stitching's been reworked to stitch first, and then tee up a choice between having each player sacrifice 2 creatures or discard 2 cards. This shreds hands a bit less effectively, but does give us a cool alternative to Nightfall by way of the Double Edict. Probably not quite as good as Nightfall, but it's neat at least. Curse of Dark Blasphemy now costs 6 mana instead of 5, making that enter trigger and draw engine a bit slower to get set up. If you're keen on this effect, it might still be worth the trouble, but it's definitely more sluggish to bring together. But hey, at least if you spend 6 mana on Witching Hour, you now break even to find this. Awoken Heir has lost its innate menace, now only gaining menace until end of turn off of its trigger if you control 3 or more vampires when it does so. It's a hit to its overall strength, but I think if you've got enough vampires to support it, it'll still do its thing, and I think even without a high density of vampires, this is still a pretty strong 1-drop. Geist Blaster's Breakthrough is catching a restriction to its discard clause, limiting it to only triggering during your turn. It's not the core function of the card by any means, but it will prevent you from using a Fabricated Anomaly puzzle box to make the token as an ambush blocker. Still a solid path to take with Stargazing, at least. Olivia's Debauchery can no longer Earthquake away a bunch of creatures and planeswalkers, and is instead now a Fireball. We did just lose Terminal Impact at this rotation, and that was one of the most important cards from Cyberos that just headed out the door, so if you're keen on fireballing something still, this might be your new option. Full Moon Assaults, moving up to 2 mana to clear room for Strangle to remain as is, while having its Flash Claws only require 1 savage creature rather than 2. It's probably not that great for constructed play now, unfortunately, but this did lead to another change. Having Claret Ascendance slide down by 1 mana and 1 damage while activating for 1 less from the graveyard. We do have Magma Spray, so 2 damage that exiles the target if it dies isn't especially important, but this being able to target the opponent in a pinch is a big upgrade from Magma Spray, as is the cheaper graveyard ability. Forget if I'd mentioned it in the review, but you already know that an activated ability makes this a candidate for Contest Coordinator as well. Ash-Addled Pyromaniac joins Omen Skulker in losing its ability to make a treasure on death, though honestly, I think that was the worst mode of the 3, so this is still pretty great. Feasting Ceremony is getting a timing restriction to only be activated during your turn, meaning you can't ambush block opponents. It's still pretty solid, and with the tokens having haste, you weren't going to often want to activate at instant speed anyhow, but it is slightly nerfed. The Haunting of Silburn's going up by 1 mana, but now animates as a 4/4 instead of a 3/3. Probably less playable overall, but still not exactly awful by any means. Gormare is a card I skimmed past, but it's dropping a point of power down to an even 2/2 stat line. Given that its buff is permanent, this isn't actually as bad as I might have indicated when I touched on it during the review, but I don't think it's going to move mountains or anything. Lunarblind Packmaster is shedding a point of power, making its enter trigger more cleanly line up with how much damage it can be expected to do when it hits something. I think this does hurt the werewolf decks a bit, so maybe you want to look to other 3-drops for your Embers of a New Moon deck, but I don't think it's awful. Wanton Display has been fully reworked from a 3-mana Pyroclasm for a 4-mana burn spell that deals 6 damage to a creature or planeswalker and 2 to its controller, costing only half as much if you have a savage creature when you cast it. This can be incredibly reliable removal for any red deck that can turn Savage on consistently, and with 1-drops like Newborn Oni or Awoken Heir, and with stuff like Fabricated Anomaly still around and kicking, this could do a lot of work. It's also pretty reasonable at 4 mana, so yeah, this is just all around a strong card. Curse of Searing Crown now hurts any player when they tap non-basic lands for mana rather than just the enchanted player. So it's far less splashable because if you have a greedy mana base, it can still punish you. But it now specifically prevents damage from being dealt to the enchanted player. It prevents damage from being prevented. My script is a little misleading on that one. It's still a good sideboard tool, just a bit more taxing the greedier your mana base is. But if you're ever worried about fog effects coming back in a real way, this can say no to that. Feudrak of Ashmouth got a solid glow up, dropping a point of power to gain haste, dropping its activated ability to pick up an enter trigger to give any creature +2 power for a turn, and having its attack trigger now be limited to only affecting creatures and planeswalkers. That last bit may look like a drawback, but considering it has haste now, it can swing in for 6 damage immediately while shocking something that might get in the way or otherwise be troublesome, and it will continue to do work the more you can lean into it with other mid-range or control tools. It is a lot more threatening now, that's for sure. The Gormoon Unleashed now exiles a fixed 3 cards if it targets a savage creature rather than cards equal to that creature's power. But rather than only free casting one of the exiled cards and the rest just being lost to history, you can just play the 3 cards that are exiled until the end of your next turn. It's honestly, I think, more interesting as a board wipe tool for mid-range strategies now, because you can more reliably recuperate your lost resources. I'm not sure it'll suddenly become constructed viable, but it's an interesting change to be sure. Secluded Recluse has lost its Ward 1, but now has Hexproof while it's tapped, meaning if it's stuck sideways, it can't eat a cheap removal spell in the process. Additionally, Unleashed Terror's transformation has lost its Reverse Menace in favor of untapping itself when it transforms, making it easier to swing in with this while it's a 3-2. It's a solid little change, making me more confident in leaning on this alongside Embers, so if you're looking to play Werewolves, this might be a good one to look for now. Gavony Watchman's swapped out Trample for Reach and had its death trigger cleaned up a bit. It's better defensively, slightly worse offensively, still a perfectly solid 2-2-4-1. Consuming Grounds no longer mills you and targets whatever it's regrowing now. And its transformed side has traded out Haste for Reach. Once it's in play as Restless Wildgraph, you can also now discard a card at each combat to untap and animate it rather than only on your own combats. It does lose Haste in the process though, so if it's summoning sick, you can't tap it for mana once it's been animated. It's not as good at working with graveyard synergies as it used to be because of the loss of the self-mill, but I think it's far better when used defensively now, so I think it's still pretty solid overall. There is a slight increase to the cost of Walled Cottage Crone's attack trigger while transformed into Somberwald Ripper, from 3 and a green to 4 and a green. I wasn't super high on this to begin with, so I think this just makes me even less confident in it showing up. Devotion to Grindanu's activated ability is now 3 black and a green to activate instead of 3 green, and requires 13 or more cards in your graveyard rather than just 7. I think it's still a solid ramp tool, and it's worth noting that between it and Trespass the Volwood, we have a total of 8 copies of 3-mana enchantments that ramp you on enter. So hey, maybe there's something like a Revolt of the Palace ramp shell that you could try to bring it together. Hope's Trail Ranger loses 1 point of toughness today, but it does gain vigilance in the trade-off. I think it's still a formidable card, and it might be the single biggest beneficiary of the battle change today, so I expect we'll still see quite a lot of it. Malignant Entangler has lost a Death Touch. It's a worse blocker now, so maybe that means it's not quite worth the trouble, but it could still be useful in a pinch. Runstalker Maiden can no longer tap itself to its second ability, meaning you have 1 fewer spell you can cast with Flash each turn. It might still be solid, it's a good pair of bodies for the cost, but it's being held back ever so slightly with this change. Arlen's Kindred is sliding down from 4 mana to 3 to clash less with the Ulvenvater on curve, dropping its stats from 4-3 all the way down to 3-1, and its enter trigger is now modal between giving hexproof or transforming a wolf or werewolf. I think despite the drop-off on stats and the ability being split, I think it's still a pretty strong reason to be in on this particular Kindred plan. I don't know if it's as strong as Embers of a New Moon by any means, but having both definitely does give you more incentives to build around this particular synergy set. Curse of Harvest's Reaping now only lets you sacrifice an attacking creature rather than any of your creatures, making it a bit less swingy overall. It's still a strong, intriguing toolbox option, and I'm sure there will still be some very weird things for folks to try with it. Lambholt Hunting Grounds now chooses between sacrificing itself to draw, or giving a creature a counter and vigilance, rather than doing both. I'm less keen on it in Constructed than before, but it was always going to be a questionable inclusion, so that's not too big of a deal. The Ulvenvater's Fight mode has been replaced with a +1/+1 counter on each wolf and werewolf you control when you choose not to make a 2/2, making it no longer capable of board controlling as hard, but it is a far more lethal Kindred payoff, and even just a far more lethal standalone threat, because its bottled 2/2 tokens not only gets to join it alongside each turn that you get where you can fire off its trigger, you can also start scaling itself and all of those 2/2 tokens. So even alone, the Ulvenvater can absolutely start to take over the board, even without being able to have your creatures fight things. Estwald Brigands is now a 4/5 instead of a 5/5, and its enter trigger has been moved from a bite effect to instead let you mill 3 and rebuy a creature you milled this way. This ties into the change to its back face, where it has also shed 1 point of power and replaced its token generation with the ability to cheat a creature from your hand into play while granting that creature haste. This is still a hell of a haymaker, especially now that it works better with other stompy tools, so I think it'll still be very likely to show up at the top of mid-range and aggro shells in green. Desperate Exorcism now bounces the targets back to hand rather than exiling, so it can no longer tax the thing you hit for your opponent, but it does compensate you with a 1/1 Flying Spirit if you bounce a Spirit Permanent or Spirit Spell back to your hand. There aren't really many cheap spirits with enter value triggers or triggers on cast that you care about, but you could use this to pick up and reset your virtualized Onomastic and maybe even destroy the construct token they had gotten from Onomastic as consolation. Drowntide Rising now costs an additional blue pip in place of one of the generic pips, and the exile from hand for each opponent is no longer random. I don't think this really does much to change my overall assessment here. If you're in on zombies, a one-sided board wipe is at least worth a sideboard slot, if nothing else. But otherwise, it's probably not that amazing when we have something like On Top of the World to turn to. Bloodbank's been simplified from its old funky replacement effect to instead let your blood sacrifice for free to rebuy a card you discarded this turn, while making a second blood token on enter. This is obviously a bummer for folks looking to do weird sacrifice things, but it could be an interesting option to help grind your decks in these colors rebuy discard fodder as needed. And hey, this isn't even the first thing we've gotten in the format that makes 2 bloods on enter. Olivia Sanguine Reveler is dropping down to 2 base toughness, but it is slightly easier to cast now. I think she's still pretty strong, so the toughness change is a tangible hit, but not one that convinces me she'll be falling off the radar anytime soon. Avacyn's Legacy's Concord ability now grants an additional +1/+1 in Ward 2 instead of hexproof and indestructible. I think it makes the creature more reasonably interactive, which could possibly push this out of the conversation, but then again, 2 mana for +2/+2, First Strike, Trample, and Ward 2 is still quite strong, so who knows, maybe it's still worth the hoops. Dawnheart Augur now only lets you play 1 card off of it per turn, and it only taps for 2 mana once you have Concord enabled. It's definitely less appealing for constructed play, but with the right build, it could still yield some card advantage turn by turn, and its function in Eternal Moonlight combo is pretty much unscathed, so it's not dead by any measure. It's another beneficiary of the battle change, too. Sermons of Ormondal now costs 1 a white and a black from just white-black, and its tokens now enter untapped. It'll be slower to get rolling, but the improved defensiveness is nice if you want this. Tenua of Whispered Pains, meanwhile, now only makes a 1/1 cleric when she dies, rather than when one of your other non-token creatures dies. It's definitely a much weaker card now, but I think the sacrifice ability on her last line is still quite strong, so still worth the trouble. Ominous Frogs is catching changes to both faces, now requiring 1 additional Croak counter to transform, so you can't really transform it off of 3 cantrips on turn 3, as well as squaring out the stats on Scourge of Vustro and shaving off Menace. I think it's still a rather strong card, with the front phase being a plenty reasonable body and effect, but it is undeniably weaker than it was before. Wildcaster Devil is losing Flash and gaining a point of power to compensate. This is a knock to any lines where you're targeting a counterspell with its enter trigger, since you can't roll the dice on it to have an attempt to try and stack interact with it, but I think it's still plenty good. Gold Knight Purgeblade can no longer block, and its first mode now deals 3 damage instead of 4. It's not going to get to be a 2-for-1 on defense, and it's going to struggle to kill larger creatures, but the battle change means that second mode is a lot stronger now, and it's still a perfectly fine 3-drop to turn 2 for controller mid-range strategies looking to pick something off while developing a creature to the board. Elgod Dawn Riders trading out Lifelink for Vigilance and having its attack trigger streamlined to just always making the token. Then anthem your other creatures for +1/+0, though not trample anymore, and making one of your creatures be able to gain Lifelink as an exchange. It's pretty trivial to bring online still, so I think this will be a pretty stellar go-wide tool. Curse of Entomophobia is going up in cost and mill by 1. It now requires 3 mana and mills the enchanted player for 4 cards. I think this is still super strong. If you curse yourself in any sort of land-centered strategy, it'll absolutely spit out a ton of 1/1s, and I'll definitely be keeping it on my radar for Druid's Shells. Winterthorn Creeper now costs 1 mana less, its stats have dropped down to 4/5, and its activated ability now costs 3 mana and 4 cards from your graveyard to tap and stun a creature while putting a +1/+1 counter on it. It's a solid body for the cost, and it ramps you on enter and attack still. And the ability gives you a lot more board control, which is always nice. Urgent Investigations now costs 1 more mana. I think it'll stay strong, though it's slightly weakened by today's battles change, because now you can't take another enchantment alongside your battle. It'll probably still be a draw 3 or 4 pretty consistently, though. Grindanu Returned is getting +1/+1 for 1 more mana. I remain skeptical on her viability, and the increased cost definitely doesn't help her in that avenue, but she's also a trickier body for small removal and sweepers to deal with, so who knows? Emrakul Visage of Gore now has hexproof as long as it entered this turn, rather than hexproof from instants and flash. This makes her easier to pick off in the long term, but you'll still be safe with her base effect if you can get her into play quickly enough. We're entering the Valir Changes now, and kicking things off with a full rework to Tomb of the Founder. Turns out, the Chromox effect was a bit too much after all, so it's trading out the Imprint cameo for a Hideaway cameo. It has Hideaway 5, taps for a colorless, and lets you spend 10 mana and tap it to play the exiled card without paying its mana cost. If that sounds awful, that's because 10 mana is not what you're usually paying, because it's reduced by 2 for each of your legendary creatures and planeswalkers. It's a more flavorful card, considering the 5 legendary creatures all wind up uncovering something long since hidden away in this location within the story, but it's definitely less competitive. It's a fun, flavorful build around, at least. Bustling Marketplace is catching a rate hit to its last ability, costing 1 more to activate now, and is also being renamed to Illicit Marketplace. Turns out, there's already a Bustling Marketplace in REV's sister format, MSCM, so best to not overlap on the names here. Call for Backup is moving from a sorcery to an instant. It's a pretty big buff to this, allowing it to more seamlessly weave into your turns where you have mana to spare. And it's also now another nudge for Blue-Green Flash to look at white mana, since this can find Interstellar Sage, Faithline Marshal, or a Silver Bullet creature during your opponent's turn, allowing you to potentially chain together both the Call for Backup and whatever you were finding right then and there. It's even better for combo, it's even better for control, even better for mid-range. Hell, it might be worth reaching for as an aggro tool. Just a solid upgrade across the board. Maybe not an aggro tool necessarily, but it's just really good. Minor change for Clash of Courage, it now destroys target non-land token. This is specifically important for ensuring it doesn't get abused with the Lotus Spring tokens from Solitaire. So no build your own Stone Rain with Path of Purity or Plaguebane Hulk. Renegade Trueheart's dropping a point of toughness in exchange for gaining lifelink. There were concerns that a 2/3 flyer might be too strong of an ambush blocker, so now it's a bit more frail while still helping survivability all the same. It'll do the expected nonsense with Getaway Proxy and company still, just with 1 less point of toughness. Eavesdrop is being replaced with Slip Through the Streets, a single mana sorcery that draws you a card while making one of your creatures unblockable for the turn. This frees up more room for Thought Scour to shine, and while it'll still struggle against the other cantrip options we have available, it'll have 1 fewer piece of competition. And if you're sad that we're not getting Eavesdrop, it'll still exist in Eternal. Expert Infiltration is now limited to enchanting your own creatures only. This cleans up an oversight where you could put this on an opposing creature and draw whenever your opponent hit you with it. It's also getting its when the creature becomes blocked ability cleaned up a bit, because there was concerns that it could get +1/+1 for each blocker, which is not intended. So it's now a lot cleaner. I think it's still pretty good, but the shenanigans have been cut down. Attuned Rebuttal is getting a glow up. Now just fully hard countering the targeted spell if it's either a creature or if you're ancient, rather than just mana leaking it. It's a much more appealing control tool now, and with things like Stargazing and Thought Scour running around, getting ancient early might be pretty achievable even outside of control. Jump the Gap is being changed to now force the exiled card to your hand at the beginning of your next end step, so you can't just threaten the strong enter trigger from exile for free forever. Still powerful, just not representing an eternal from exile value bomb like it was before. Swift Step Robber's enter trigger is no longer indefinite, instead giving the targeted creature a robbed counter and conferring its stats and text to robbed creatures while it's in play. This does mean it no longer changes the target's name, mana cost, color, or type line, but that's probably not the main reason you wanted to look for this anyhow. I didn't think of this at the time of scripting, but it did just occur to me. This also means you can now move around the robbed counter from one of your own creatures to an opposing creature with Hergast. So whether you're facing off against a Swift Step Robber, or you use this to let one of your own creatures swing in early, and then use Hergast to debuff an opposing creature while letting your creature regain its text, could be neat. Juniper's Awakening is taking a slight hit, now making its tokens tapped, so it can't immediately represent a 5/5 blocker all on its own. It's still a really cool option for a new kind of control shell in blue, but we'll see if tap out control is something that could actually arise in blue. Desperate Ambusher's end step trigger has been streamlined, and it's trading off entering tapped for not being able to block altogether. Still a solid reward for being in on the Mercs plan, and with that type change to Mercenary of Dusk, there's a solid, cute little black aggro core to look at here now. Malicious Pact Maker is losing a point of toughness and now gets to trigger once each turn for its counter generation rather than indefinitely. But it also now has Menace permanently instead of only on the Surveil trigger. So you aren't priced into needing to Surveil to get the evasion and won't miss out on value from surveilling on the opponent's turn. Still a solid aggro or mid-range piece to try out. Coffer's Altar is having its both modes clause now check for a non-token creature sacrificed rather than a creature with mana value 2 or greater. This means that token copies of creatures with mana value 2 or greater no longer work to draw and make a treasure, but you can also use this with the whole host of strong 1-drops to sacrifice for a bit more value now. Shame about Omen Skulker, but it still works with Newborn Oni, and it still does some very silly stuff with Devoted Lackeys. Soya Nell's Executioner is receiving changes to both of her faces, with her attack trigger no longer dealing 1 to you, but only drawing a card if the opponent can't discard. So lands that get pitched don't give you card advantage anymore. So you're basically getting an option between having your opponent discard a card to get a loyalty counter on her, or drawing a card if they can't. Her -1 also no longer can regrow legendary permanents. You can still buy back some really strong tools, but you can't buy back Soya with Soya, so you have to be at least a little responsible with her, because once you lose her, you can't get her back with her own -1. Dundeal's Treasures are now created tapped, cutting any combo potential in its infancy, but this does also just emphasize the banked mana available here, so if you really want to build up your coffers, this could still be a real consideration. High Priestess Saimi got a full rework, shedding a point of power and toughness to have a 1 per turn trigger, letting you copy a spell or ability that required you to sacrifice creatures as a cost, and a 2-mana exile 2 cards from graveyard sorcery speed activation to make an Acolyte token. This adds redundancy to the Devoted Lackeys avenue of play, if you're willing to pay 4 mana to get such an engine on the board. It works with Bone Shards and Beyond the Shroud pretty effectively, and hey, look, an activated ability that even has white mana in it. I wonder what might improve consistency in finding this. Vi Fallen Hope's 0 ability now forces you to immediately cast the exiled card, just letting it patch the same hole that Jump the Gap had. Impromptu exits, shedding the artifact removal entirely, but going down to 1 mana so it can be a functional reprint of End the Festivities. If you're struggling with token decks, maybe this will help. Vi's Lieutenant is taking a hit to its muster trigger, now only antheming all of your non-token creatures the second time it resolves in a turn, and otherwise only buffing itself. After the sudden onset of Solidarity's prominence towards the end of last season, folks weren't exactly keen on something reminiscent of that entering right as that mechanic headed out the door, so now Lieutenant's a bit more self-contained. I think it's still solid, but obviously a lot weaker than it was. Brazen Burglar's picking up a second red pip in place of its generic mana cost, so it'll be a bit more cost restrictive, so you can't run it as freely in multicolor decks. While Daring Escapees is having its enter trigger move to an attack trigger that just checks if you've had a rogue enter in your turn to falter something. I think both of these hasty rogues will have a place in the format, but Daring Escapees is definitely a bit weaker because you can't have multiple rogues enter to falter multiple opposing creatures. And Brazen Burglar is definitely still very strong, but it's going to look a lot better in mono red than in 2 or 3 color decks than it would have previously. Sunset Champion's stats are squaring out now, and its Titan trigger is getting cleaned up by a lot. It now only exiles 1 card and does not cost reduce it. Still a very solid threat with long-term value if left unchecked, so I think it still has a real shot at making waves. Reckless Showoff joins Futurak in getting a glow up. Its Spectacle Condition has an enter trigger, let me rephrase that. Its Spectacle Condition enter trigger has been moved from 4 burn damage to an extra combat effect, untapping one of your other creatures that attacked this turn in the process. This alleviates the awkwardness of haste on a Spectacle card that's best in the second main, and makes it far more explosive if you can line this up properly. My god, my words. I recorded the part 2 review yesterday, so it's been a hell of a 48 hours, folks. Setral Arborist also got an overhaul to clean up its tension, now getting to be a 1/2 with Vigilance, Reach, and a Surveil 1 attack trigger. Beyond that, it gets to be a 1 mana 3/4 as long as you're Ancient. It's a solid workhorse 1-drop, and it gives you another piece for the potential aggro self-mill build of Druids alongside Enigmatic Apothecary and Voice of the Old Grove. I don't know if that full self-mill Ancient build is going to be too strong. I don't remember it being especially great in black-green back in Blood Like Rivers, but I mean, I did play it in Blood Like Rivers, and it was winning games, so maybe you could try this out a more tempo-y aggro plan, since blue gives you access to counter spells and bounce spells. Shroud Piercers surveilling 1 card instead of 2, both on its enter and graveyard abilities, but it can also be exiled from your graveyard for 1 less mana. It's still a pretty solid tool for ninjas and the like if you want to take it for the spin, it's just not going to dig you as deep. The Central Shaper's activated ability now costs 2 in a blue to transform into Junie rather than just 1 in a blue, so it's a bit trickier to line up on an early flip if you have a tapped land on turn 3. Does make them a bit more expensive as a top deck as well, but considering the potential value when you top deck Junie, that's a pretty small price to pay overall. Volwood Deadeye's stats are squaring out to 2/2 from the previous 3/2 stat line. Still a solid self-scaling creature, so if you can find a good density of mercenaries, it'll do wonders, but it's definitely more reliant on that synergy to be worth the trouble now. Helping out with that density in Stompy Shells is the change to Winding Assailant. There was an issue with a couple of Valir cards making multiple Death Touchers in a single turn, so now Assailant's a 3-mana 4/4 with Trample that pursues for 3 and triple green to get back a pair of 4/4 Tramplers. Strong stompy body, and if you can get the odd trinket permanent into play in such a shell, Assailant can leverage that later on into more board presence in the deeper turns of the game. Laybound Ritualist's activated ability is being nudged down to only look at 3 cards instead of 4. This is partly to curb the draw power in decks without instants or sorceries, and partly to just clean up the fact that it was the only appearance of the number 4 on a card otherwise flush with 3s. Sometimes I'm just inclined towards simple reasons for changes, but also, yeah, that AA finding 4 cards is a bit too much. The other multi-death toucher card was Ruthless Duo, which is jumping up in cost from to 4 mana and having its base body move from a 1/1 with Death Touch to a 3/2 with Trample. It's not really a constructed card, but if you were eyeing it for defensive purposes, it just won't hit the same way. The Steamed Exterminator is shedding its hexproof from instants in favor of a simple Ward 2. This makes it eligible to be picked off by instant speed interaction now, but it makes it much, much harder for targeted removal to break even on, because it'll often demand as much mana to remove as it was cast for, if not more. Wayland Bloodhunter's activated ability is creeping up to 2 mana to make it a bit less free to pick off opposing creatures with it, or select a bunch of opposing creatures ahead of a board wipe. She's still a really strong card, so I'd imagine she'll be swinging in a lot, but just a bit slower to do the repeat removal thing, especially if you intended to do so the turn that you play her. Heart of the Grove has been renamed to Call of the Grove, and now costs 1 more mana, but that's not because it was too strong already, that's because it now also triggers when it enters. This makes it a much more exciting build around with some real immediacy behind it, and I have Grove Adventures high on my list of janky decks to try out. I really did not expect the first thing I would want to try to build for Kindred decks being Spirits, and not Innistrad Spirits, but Solitaire Spirits, but Call of the Grove with the Adventure Spirits is really exciting. Almost done, folks. Just multicolor and colorless left to go. Starry-Eyed Scholars losing Ward 1 to make it more easily removable, though with 4 toughness, red in particular will still struggle to pick this off, so if you're looking for safe engines to try out, this might be worth the trouble. You've got a 0 mana artifact as well, so double spelling on turn 3 is feasible with this thing. Founder's Malice got a full redesign, going to 3 mana to bounce a non-land permanent to its owner's hand and make that player discard a card, and flashing back for a whopping 7 mana. This is a lot more of a limited card than it was previously, but the original version wasn't really a safe design, so it's a small price to pay. Memoriam's effect has been changed from rebuying 2 non-creature non-land cards to instead rebuy up to 1 creature and up to 1 instant or sorcery. This is definitely less open-ended since it can't regrow Planeswalkers, artifacts, or enchantments anymore, but being able to rebuy a creature gives it a bit more flexibility in terms of what you could try and plan to get back. I'm not sure it'll outperform Mysteries of the Forbidden, but maybe they could try to coexist, especially since one draws from the graveyard while the other draws from the library. And hey, if you're picking up a creature with Memoriam, that's not going to eat into Mysteries too much, and if you pick up an instant or sorcery that you have multiples of in your graveyard, that doesn't affect Mysteries count at all. Siren's Betrayal, as it was originally introduced, is simply not a multicolored card, and at least certainly not in the colors that it was in. So, fortunately, that's fixed now because it has gotten a full redesign. It's now 4 mana for a Threaten that gives the stolen creature menace and haste for the turn before handing it back, while also being able to be cast for 2 less if you can exile 3 cards from your graveyard as you cast it. A 2-mana Threaten is definitely strong, especially when it gives the stolen creature evasion in the form of menace, so this may have a real shot at seeing some constructed play, but we'll have to wait and see. Avarice's removal mode made it very likely that you could just deny your opponent 2 blockers at all times, so they couldn't stop you from hitting them for 6. So, it now has each player lose 2 life instead. This also prevents the ability from fizzling, whether your opponent wants it to do so or if you want it to fizzle. I think it's definitely a weaker effect overall, but I think this Titan trigger is still pretty strong overall. Shroud Warder Phoenix now triggers to return at the start of combat on your turn rather than when you attack. It's better at coming in for damage and doesn't require you to be on board as much, so it might have more of a shot at making waves, especially considering the biggest Phoenix on the block just got knocked down a few pegs. So, who knows? Sanctum Deathspeaker has gotten a pretty nice facelift, shedding a point of toughness and the sacrifice ability to instead passively anthem your warlocks rather than only the ones that enter the turn after it. And it gets a +1/+1 counter once per turn whenever a creature token you control dies, instead of having to tap and sacrifice to do so. Tap and sacrifice something else to do so, rather. It's better with a wide board of Acolytes and other warlocks already sticking around, and it's still easy to buff with Acolytes thanks to their own innate sack ability. Sorolla Vile Preacher is gaining lifelink, allowing her to contribute 2 of the 3 life needed for you to draw a card. This makes her a lot more reliable, since between the attack and 1 warlock dying, that turns on her draw mode already. But attacking in with a 2/2 isn't free by any means, so it's not always going to be able to just be swing with Sorolla, have a warlock die to draw. Profane Scripture is no longer sacrificing creatures as an additional cost, and instead searches up a card exiled face down, allowing you to either sacrifice creatures exactly equal to the card's mana value to free cast it, or otherwise put the unknown card into your hand. This is a slight nerf to the efficiency, since you can't cast a 5-drop off of 4 creatures, for instance, and this means that it also doesn't work with anything like Devoted Lackeys or Saime now, but not sacrificing as a cost means you don't expose this to a blowout from stack interaction, and the fail state of putting the card to your hand makes this Diabolic Tutor at its floor, so it is a little bit more reliable. Grand Larceny is also getting a facelift due to a weird base effect previously. Its text is now modal, letting you choose between dealing 2 damage, split between up to 2 targets, or drawing a card, and if it was spectacled, you can choose both modes. It's a much more reliable effect now. Smooth Operation is up to 3 mana, in part because it triggers off of future copies of itself. It's still a solid engine, so if you're inclined to mess around with it, it'll still absolutely do work. Ruthless Stalker got a redesign to clear the way for Winding Assailant to become that 3 mana 4/4, leading to this becoming a 2 mana 2/2 with Menace and Pursuit for 4, as well as an end step trigger to get a +1/+1 counter if you sacrificed a non-land permanent in the turn. It's pretty tricky to get that lined up the turn you play it. You could feasibly do so with either Newborn Oni into Deadly Dispute, or more simply with Sacrificial Lamb on one, but otherwise it's just a simple steadily escalating threat that guarantees a trigger when you pursue it. Torval Scion of Rot is no longer uncounterable, probably because it's an absolute heavyweight if you can sacrifice a few permanents leading up to it. The bigger the treasure stockpile, the harder this thing swings for when you play it, so if you're not fazed by stack interaction, you could still try to steamroll your opponents with this. Valiant Firebrand's getting a small change to make its last ability easier to track, exiling the card to let you play it the turn you discard it. This does have one small knock-on effect, though, in that it makes Ayeshi's Agent a lot better at spitting out 1/1 birds as you discard creatures over and over. If that sounds like a good time to you, this is a new synergy available to try out. Glimpse the World Soul's budging for the ramp roll to... Glimpse the World Soul's budging from the ramp roll to leave room for Teeming Secrets, and instead is now an instant speed regrowth that exiles upon resolution and lets you put an additional card from your graveyard on top of your library if you're ancient. It's a solid controller flash tool, not something that will necessarily crop up always, but it looks pretty good when it does so. Voice of the Old Grove's Ancient mode puts too many counters on things, so it's being scaled down from a whopping 4 down to a measly 3 counters. Yeah, that's still a lot of counters, I know, and it'll still get to be a very lethal threat as a result. I've already seen some folks get reps in with this in the time it's taken for me to script this, so it'll be a force for sure. Last, but certainly not least, we have Prized Possession, which is drawing the equipped creature's controller one fewer card each time it triggers, but which now only costs 1 mana to put into play. It's still very risky to lean on, but the lower cost makes it easier to use with venture capitalist, Moonbeam Artisan, and the like, so maybe it gets to be more consistent and viable now when you are looking to find it. And that concludes the update for Valir the Banished Isle, Innistrad Witching Hour, and all of the other many things changing as our first month of the summer 2026 rotation begins. There are so many cool strategies opening up in the field thanks to both the new sets and hits to previous icons of the field clearing the way. And I can't decide whether I should start by messing around with my own cards or see if there are any Innistrad cards I can crack open. Once again, you can find the links to all the key resources in the description below, and until the next Grand Prix kicks off, I'll see you all in the Revolution chat. Bye-bye!